Sophie over where we can see you. There she is. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Sicotte-Guilbeault, a law firm here in the East End of Ottawa, and also formerly with the Montfort Hospital as Director, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can correct me on your title, but you helped oversee the emergency department, and you were a director there. And so dealing with emergency medical situations is certainly something that you are not foreign to. You're very accustomed with. So we're glad to have you here as well. Before we jump into the conversation today and start looking at some different things that we're all dealing with and perhaps some best practices that we can glean from one another, just yesterday I posted an article on my LinkedIn feed. I'm going to go ahead and just throw the link up in the chat for those of you who might want to look at this later. But it was based on an article that my mentor, Jim Harrington, forwarded to me just last week. And in this article, the author compares the current season that we're going through using a weather analogy that I thought was extremely helpful and that we've been using within Rhapsody to help us understand sort of the times that we're living in. By a show of hands, and perhaps even for those of you that are here by audio only, just even in the chat, how many had hoped that this would just be a storm that blows over quickly? Right? I think that was the norm. We all hoped that when this first broke, that this would be, in many words, like a blizzard. Think of the last time a major blizzard blew into town and, they issued a weather warning saying, folks, hunker down. This is going to be the next 24, 48 hours, maybe a little rough for driving and conditions are going to be bad. And what do we do? As hardy Canadians, we just hunker down, we weather the storm and get back to life as normal pretty quickly. What the author went on to say is that COVID-19 is no blizzard. It is, if you are familiar, do we have any Game of Thrones fans? Any Game of Thrones fans here? Let me see your hands. Yeah, anybody? Are you familiar with the term winter is coming? Right? It's a term that's pretty common in that show, and if you're not, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. The point is that the author went on to say that this is no blizzard. Even though here as Canadians we were hoping for spring, and certainly from in terms of the meteorology, spring is upon us. This is from a business perspective, economy perspective, more of a winter. This is less of a storm that we're going to just hope to hunker down and get through, and more like a season of several months where this new reality has settled in and changed things for all of us. The world, we were talking about this and have been talking about this internally as a team, and I've been having this conversation with many of my clients. The world as we know it for the foreseeable future has changed. And the best news that we have from the most reliable sources are assuring us that, we need to hunker down, be prepared that for the next several months, COVID-19 is going to be front and center, and that we'll be well into summer before this thing is under control. Now, that's not great news. None of us wants to, perhaps, we would all hope that the story was different, but that's the reality. That instead of a storm that we're hunkering down just to get through, it's more of a season that we need to be prepared for, like a winter season where we know for the next several months, our reality is going to be shaped by the season that we're in. The author of the article went on to talk about how, in certain cases, a prolonged season of winter can lead to what's called an ice age. Now, he wasn't referring to an ice age that would last hundreds of years, but rather to a period of cooling in the economy that even after the immediate crisis is over, I think those of us that are savvy and have been watching the news and have some experience in business know that the economy, even with all the aid that's being promised, is not going to bounce back overnight. It's going to take some time. And that our businesses are going to feel this over the long term, that we're probably looking at an ice age of 12 to 18 months before we start to see things begin to return to any sense of normalcy. Now, again, I wish I wasn't opening with this, but I think savvy leaders and wise leaders are saying we need to be prepared for the long haul here. So in the midst of that, if that's the case, then how do we deal with the anxiety that we're feeling as leaders for our teams, for our families, and how do we take care of ourselves? We know that leaders are under tremendous pressure at any given time Forget about COVID-19. Leaders carry a heavy load on the best of days, and now are being called to carry an even heavier load. So Kathy, I'd like to put the question to you first. Before we even talk about managing the anxiety within our teams right now, how do leaders, from your perspective, best take care of themselves in this current crisis that we know is going to be with us for a while? What are some best practices that you would recommend?
Well, I was hoping to hear some people's stories to a certain extent as well. However, if you want me to jump right into the best practices, I will go right for it.
Yeah.
I think that it's not just about paradigm shifts that are shifting, it's about survival. Like this is deep-rooted fear, anxiety. It's not generalized anxiety. There's some really deep fears going on. And the biggest thing I can say is let yourself admit that you're afraid. Let yourself have those feelings with someone you trust, a friend, a partner, a counselor, somebody. Because often, especially leaders who are strong, they deny what they're really feeling and experiencing. But it always comes out sideways in that term. When we're feeling uncertainty, it can come out in, obviously, fear. It can come out in anger. It can come out in control. It can come out in procrastinating. It can come out in many different ways. But you can't fool the truth inside of us. So you may think you can fool it, but eventually it's going to come out. So that's number one. And then the second part of it is, how do you not get stuck in it? How do you let yourself have it, admit it, talk about it, and then move forward? And the biggest thing, and everybody knows how to take care of themselves, so I'm going to focus more on the mindset, is thinking about your thoughts, because we can have almost 1,800 thoughts a minute, and we're not conscious of them. They're just spitting out like crazy, like a computer. And unfortunately, we believe them all, but we don't have to. We don't have to believe them. So think about your thinking. What are your fearful thoughts? Research shows, after 35 years of research, if you get them out of here and write them down on paper, that significantly starts to shift them, reduce them. Then you can challenge them. Then you can talk back to them. There's 10 different negative thinking patterns. I can email everybody that handout if you're interested as well. Find what are your common negative thinking patterns. Are you catastrophizing? Are you minimizing? Are you in black and white thinking? Are you labeling? There's all sorts of different ways, and our thoughts create our feelings. We may all of a sudden feel fear or all of a sudden feel anxiety, but your mind has been churning for a while. So your thoughts are extremely important. Your feelings are extremely important. And I think then one of the tips I often suggest is anxiety is all about the future. What ifs? What if? What if? What if? So instead of the what if, just slight little subtle change is change it to I wonder how blah 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 will be. I wonder how I'm going to finish A, B, and C, instead of what if I don't? What if I don't? What if I don't? And then also, you can challenge the what ifs. So sometimes we need to create a then what plan. Okay, what if? Okay, then what? So then what, for some people, might mean I need a big plan. I need plan A, B, C, D, and E. Some people only need a plan for this morning and then a plan for this afternoon. And there's no right or wrong. It's more about who are you and how are you going to be able to manage your thoughts. Rumination is very, we can spin into it quite quickly. So one of the other things, it sounds really silly, but it does work actually, is set aside a time that you're going to let yourself worry. It's called worry time. So every day, let's say at 2 o'clock, I'm going to sit down with a cup of tea and I am going to let myself worry for 15 minutes. I'm going to set an alarm. And then as soon as that worry time's over, I'm going to go for a walk. or I'm going to play with my dog. Okay, so then you know every day at 2 o'clock you're going to have that time, and your mind starts spinning at 8 o'clock in the morning. You can say, oh, 2 o'clock, I'm going to sit down and do my worry time. And it does work. It does work. So I'm trying to give you a few ideas,
right,
that people can use. And then there's the compassion piece. So when people get into fear and uncertainty, we all do, we become self-absorbed. And so, you know, countering that is, how can you obviously have compassion for you and your situation, and how can you have compassion outside of you, right?
right.
I have several nurses, ICU nurses, I have ER nurses, and I asked one of them yesterday, saying, I know I'm going to be speaking to a group of business owners, you know, what do you guys need? Like, how can people show how important you are and how we can thank you? And obviously the number one thing was stay at home. And then the number two thing is, she said, we got some donuts delivered, and we had, I mean, there's lots of different things we can contribute. She said that just made our day. It made us realize that people were thinking about us and appreciated us.
Right.
So there's a compassion, and there's us bonding together as not only a city, but a country and the world. Right. Anyways, so there's some starting points. No,
that's great, Kathy. I think on your point of compassion and even little acts of kindness towards others, often there's so many things right now. I think it's safe to say there's probably a lot of folks on this call that feel that there's a lot of things you can't control, that are beyond your ability to influence. And yet every time we reach out and help one another, do something kind for another person, that's something that we can control. It helps us feel in many ways like we're handling the situation a little bit better. I'd love to see, before I turn the attention to Sophie and talk to her about how, from her perspective, leaders in these types of crisis situations can care for themselves. And that's really where we wanted the call to start. Because again, the toll that this is taking on leaders currently and taking on all of you is significant. We're leaders on this call. I've got my colleagues, Trevor and Rob, and guys, feel free to jump in anytime, of course, on this. We're feeling very much the same things that you are, right? So that it's taking a toll on all of us. But I would love to see in chat, just go ahead and start typing in, what are some of the things that you do to take care of yourself, to make a deposit, what are the self-care rituals that you're practicing right now that you're finding most useful? And remember, this is the opportunity for us to share what we're doing to stay healthy, stay strong in this time of crisis. And as you begin to type those in there, I'm going to turn it over to Sophie and say, Sophie, from your experience, how do leaders in this type of crisis make sure that their reserves are maintained so that they can then be of support to others? So take it away, Sophie.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Certainly, it's very strange for me as a nurse by background who's only been at the law firm for about a month. I'm having very ambivalent feelings about being away from my nursing people. Like you mentioned, I was in charge of the emergency department and the ICU at the Montfort for many years. So my timing was either perfect, according to my husband, for leaving the hospital. But my heart is saying, oh, I'm not there for them, which I've been for SARS and for other incidents that we've had, Ebola and things like that. So definitely from a crisis perspective, it is about managing, and I think Kathy spoke to it as well, and you just did as well, controlling what you can control and letting go of the things that you can't control are very important, not just for leaders, but I've used that probably 3 times already this week, and it's only Tuesday. Is it only Tuesday? It feels like
doesn't it feel like Friday already?
Yeah, exactly. I've used it with my brother who's stuck overseas in Philippines. I've used it with my dad who was worried about my brother. I've used it with a lot of employees. I've used it with some of the lawyers and partners here at the law firm as well. So to me, taking care of myself, or what works for me for leaders, is being transparent and being vulnerable. So vulnerable leadership is really important. knowing that we're all in this together and that I don't have all the answers, sharing the leadership as well, you know, not just owning it all and saying, I'm going to be the one that's going to fix everything. I've had people bring stuff to me, very micro things that when I turn it back and say, you can own this. You don't need Sophie to be communicating to everybody about every little micro thing. Yes, communication is key. I think trying to get ahead of what questions and worries people will have, your team will have. That's been, and feedback on my end has been good that I'm giving communication every 2 days about what's happening, and sometimes every day when the government decides about essential businesses at the last minute kind of thing.
Right.
But it really is about communication, but also letting people, empowering people to make certain decisions. This is a public health crisis, and it really is about everybody's public health. So it's not because Sophie didn't say that you can or can't come into the office, or that you need to wash your hands, or those kind of things, or that you need to stay 2 meters away, that this is the, you know, that this is not possible for you to do. So a lot of people sometimes in a crisis, and I've seen this in healthcare and I see it now as well, will, in a panic, will have a hard time seeing the forest for the trees and kind of catastrophize, like Kathy said, many things. We have to be compassionate with it, but we have to also, I think, be a sounding board for them, be the calm within the storm. You know, let them know that we're all in this together and that we're going to tackle one problem at a time, 1 hour at a time, in this case, oftentimes, because you can have a plan for the day and it won't happen. You can have a plan for the week and it definitely won't happen. So certainly I'd say, you know, caring for yourself as well, trying to disconnect when you need to. I really love Kathy's idea about setting some worry time so that you're not losing sleep over this. Certainly for me, it's when I'm lying in bed at night or first thing when I wake up in the morning, where you go, okay, you know, I'm worried about this. Oh, I didn't do this today, those kind of things. So giving yourself permission to not try and fix everything in one day, and knowing that we don't have all the answers. And even if we do today, it might change tomorrow, and we need to be okay with that. And you need to be vulnerable with staff to let them know that's the case. I sent them an email last week to remind them that social distancing is more about physical distancing, but it's really important to connect with human connection is really important right now. We're all in this together across the globe, and it's really important to stay connected. So despite us all working from home, we're making efforts to still connect. At the office, we have Fashion Wednesdays, where we usually have a color and people dress up, and we decided to keep it for tomorrow. So even though we're working from home, everybody will be sending each other pictures of their workspace and what they're wearing, and we're going to be doing a video conference team meeting as well to make sure that we're still staying connected and checking in with each other. We've shared past times with each other about, I shared my cat that's laying all over my 1,000-piece puzzle that I've been trying to do for 3 days. But, you know, certainly people are sharing different things that their families are doing. This is about caring for one another. Like Kathy mentioned, this is life or death stuff. So it's very similar to what I saw and felt in the emergent ICU. So staying safe is important, trying to balance your time with your family as well, not just work, and taking care of their needs and your needs as well. Obviously, the obvious things like getting sleep, drinking, and eating well, and doing some exercise at home is good as well.
Right, that's fantastic. And we see so much of that being reflected in the comments here, both in Zoom and coming from Facebook. Many of the self-care exercises or rituals that many of you are practicing. And there's too many to even list, but if you just scroll through the chat, you can see so many great suggestions here. You talked about losing sleep. How many here would be willing to admit that there's been more than one day where you woke up and as soon as the reality of what's happening hit your mind, one of your first responses was, I wished it was just all a dream, right? Where we kind of said like, wow, no, this is the reality. I'd love to hear from both of you about the importance of so many great things said already. FaceTime Vino hour, I like that, Kathy. But like to hear from both of you about the importance right now for leaders of having a good support system. Again, the challenge for leaders is we're carrying the extra load of the business, of our staff and their families, and yet we've got our own families. I know that I just got my daughter back Thursday night. from Europe. She was on supposed to be on a 6-month exchange program with Ottawa U, and last week, as we were trying to get her back, was incredibly stressful. Are we going to get her out of Europe? Is she going to come home? And now all of us here are under a 14-day quarantine because she's here with us, and we're just trying to be as safe as possible. So here is just an example, and many of you have your own stories of things that you're dealing with on the personal level that, aside from the business, which is your livelihood, and you've put so much blood, sweat, and tears into it, you have staff that you're concerned about in their families, and you got your own personal, your own family, your own personal concerns. Fancy PJs, I like that. We might have to adopt that for Rhapsody, although I don't think I own fancy PJs. Thanks, Sophie. But could both of you speak to, and I'll ask Kathy to go first, followed by Sophie, the importance of a leader's support system right now, or support network, or the importance of not isolating and trying to carry this load alone? Kathy, over to you.
Thanks. I think that, and I've seen a few companies do it. Trevor and I were involved with a company last week, having check-ins, and specifically on how are you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on with you? Your fears, your worries, your concerns. And Catherine actually mentioned that in the chat, is vulnerable and constant communication with your team members. I think that's extremely important. And listening without judgment and without having to give advice. It's really hard to listen to someone in pain. However, that's what they really need. That's what they need, because once someone feels heard, often then they can start moving forward. Or they're, if they're up for advice or ideas, they're then more open to listen. But if someone's in fear, their logical part of their brain's not there. So getting into what to do is not there either. So that's my input right now. Right.
And what would you say, Kathy, to the need for a leader to make sure that not only are they being a support to others, but that they're getting support? Because, and again, there doesn't need to be a show of hands here, but listen, long before COVID-19, in the line of work that we do, working with leaders in multiple industries, all kinds of businesses, to know that or understand clearly that leadership can often feel very lonely, and that often leaders even afraid to bring it home to their spouses and talk to them sometimes about some of the challenges they're facing on that front, because they don't want to stress their spouse out, and how these dynamics might be right now exacerbated by what's happening. So again, how would you encourage leaders right now to reach out and make sure they've got people they can talk to get the support they need?
That's a good question. I think having maybe a small group of leaders having a Zoom meeting together, even if it's just 2 or 3. I know that many of us at Rhapsody get coached and or have our own counselor that we can speak with, to Eric's point, because you can just be real. You can be authentic. You don't have to be concerned about confidentiality or judgment. I think that's the 2 pieces I would mention.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Sophie, how would you weigh in on that? The importance of leaders making sure they have the support system in place, because you can't give what you don't have, at least not for very long. So what would you say to leaders about the importance of a support system?
Yeah, for sure. You have to do like flight attendants tell us with the oxygen, right? Give it to yourself before you can help others.
Right.
I agree with some of your suggestions. Certainly using, your spouse as a sounding board, because we're all stuck inside anyway. So if it's feasible, I don't have a problem stressing out my husband. He can put up with it. Just sometimes to help bounce an idea off of. Sometimes if there's no confidentiality issues, really sharing some difficult decisions we need to make. Having a small group of colleagues as well. For us, we have the partners in legal services where we have check-in meetings twice a week, and we're doing a little bit of checking in personally. How are things going? And then splitting up some of the work as well, so that it's not falling all on one person. Seeing where everybody's at. We all have ebbs and flows. Some days our cup is full, other days it's not, and being there for one another to share that load. That's why I mentioned sharing the leadership before as well. I really think that part's important. On a personal level too, I have a small, group of girlfriends on Facebook. There's 6 of us that are on there regularly, sharing real life stories, helping to, one of them's a lawyer with Health Canada, working with border services, and another one's a teacher, another one's a nurse, and people from all over the world that are experiencing this in a different way, but all leaders in their own way, whether it's managing their family or in a formal leadership role. So sometimes we can learn from one another about what works well for them that we can kind of take with us and try ourselves, or if it's really just a little bit of therapy with some wine. I know Kathy mentioned FaceTime vino. I was going to mention tequila, but wine works as well. We watched 90 Day Fiance on Sunday with a glass of wine, all of us by FaceTime, so that worked well. Sometimes just turning off your brain for a little while, and whether it's 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, will recharge it so that you can be your best self the next day and be back at it 100%.
Right. I was looking at the CDC website today about, again, advice for leader, all great advice, and advice for leaders that are dealing with stressed out teams and dealing with their own stress. And many of the things already mentioned, one of them is taking a break from the news from time to time, because just being, checking in constantly on CBC or CNN or whatever your news source of choice is can be highly stressful. Again, we need to be informed, but sometimes we need that mental health break, right? Trev, jump on in, brother.
Well, I think you raised a great point there, Eric, and I'd love to hear from Sophie and Kathy around this. What should we eliminate? What would be great for us to stop doing in the midst of this right now in order to help manage our anxiety, either with the support at the leadership level or more broadly?
I think the social media piece, or just media as a whole, is a great example. I've actually shared that with my staff as well, to say that's part of mental health. It's okay to not be okay, I think is a real thing. And for us to be feeling that and trying to convince yourself that everything is okay is something we need to let go of, because sometimes it's not. There are moments in the day where when you're talking about implementing emergency measures acts and things like that, and you're really concerned for your kids or for your family or for your colleagues, I think letting go of pretending everything's okay is a kind of a release. I mean, you have to balance vigilance with paranoia too. I think letting go of the paranoia is another thing too. When you're watching too much social media, things kind of tend to be a little bit more sensationalistic than they really are. So to me, letting go of what's not controllable. What can't you control? I can't control everything right now. That has been, I think, the best, grounding way of managing it all.
Mm-hmm.
That's so great. Kathy.
And I'd like to add to that is judgment of self. I think leaders who may be a lot of D's or DI's on the DISC profile can be quite hard on themselves and others. It's sometimes a way to cope. So it was funny, I've never played games on my phone. I found this Words with Friends. A friend invited me. So it's like playing Scrabble. And even on the Scrabble, I wasn't getting upset because I was losing, because I was losing. I was getting upset at myself because I couldn't use those letters. I thought, whoa, look at this, right? I'm judging myself on a silly game. And so catching that and being able to sit back and know that can come up in my personality at times helped me start doing self-reflection. So judgment of self and others, I think that's one of the big things we need to let go of, because it's a time of crisis as well.
Right. And we've been talking a lot about this at Rhapsody, that it's interesting that when you think of leaders in history that have really stood out, they're the men and women who in times of crisis have found the strength to be a voice for others and to be a strength to others. The ability to then be able to find grace and strength for oneself is so important. And that's what we're seeing here in the thread. So many people posting about sharing what they're doing to strengthen themselves. And I know that you talk about playing games with somebody else online. It's interesting to watch the creative ways that people are maintaining connection with others. I've even heard of Facebook parties where folks are watching Netflix together, right? In different locations. I mean, people are getting creative in this time. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm so glad that they're shifting the language from a social distancing to physical distancing, because one almost implies a disconnect from other people. And though we need to be disconnected physically and separated physically, if there was ever a time where community was important, it's certainly now. We've spent well over half our call already talking about the need for self-care, and we're not certainly going to exclude any more ideas on that front. We want to be wide open to that. But in a moment, I'm going to shift the conversation and again back to Kathy and Sophie on again best practice. What are they seeing with team members? What are they seeing with folks struggling right now through this crisis, and advice then and pointers for us as leaders to know how we can be of support to our team. I know that there's folks on this call that so many. We were on a call with a colleague of ours this morning, and in his industry, what he's hearing is so many companies are laying people off, and so leaders are carrying that pressure as well. But how we can be a support to leaders. I'd love to hear if you've got questions about how to best do that, or things that you're doing to support your team right now, your employees. I would love to see you. We would love to see that posted in chat again. We may not be able to highlight all of your suggestions or thoughts on this call, but we are going to be compiling your ideas and thoughts, and they will go into the report that we'll make available to the larger business community here locally and beyond. And so really, this is really about us coming together. The challenge with a large conversation is it's hard to get everyone to weigh in verbally on a call like this. But it's an opportunity for us to hear some best practice and share them digitally in a format that then we can make available to others. So we'd love to hear both your questions and your best practices. What are you doing currently to support your team members through this? And let me start with Sophie this time. Sophie, I mean, you've managed an emergency department, and now you're managing a law firm. And what are you learning through this? What are some of the best practices that you're leaning on at this time to support members of your team and that you've used in the past that have been very successful?
I think the way I could sum it up is extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary strategies. So kind of the 80-20 rule, like 80% of the time you can follow guidelines and there's always going to be 20% exceptions. Well, this is kind of the 1% exception. So some of the things that have worked, or that I've had to kind of coach some of our people with is, but we have people working from home. How do we know they're actually 100% productive? How do we know that they've actually worked their 70 hours in this last 2 weeks? And having to just say to them, you don't, and it doesn't matter right now. This is a business decision that we're making because our priority is the safety and security of our employees, of our clients, and we know that this is an exception, and we know that this is part of it. Yes, we're going to have to make some difficult decisions moving forward in the next 30 days. We may have to move to layoffs and those kind of things. But for now, we've made a business decision to say, in the best interest of everybody work from home. And you have to let go of some old paradigms and some old ways of functioning that are very, micromanaging in a way, and timekeeping, and knowing that, the productivity will go down, and it's okay. It's okay that that's where we're at, because you have to shift your thinking away from, even though we want to save the business and it's a priority to do that, you have to shift it from the regular 80% of the time to, okay, take out your book about the exceptions, which we know doesn't exist. And it really is about blank pages and really kind of saying, we're just flying by the seat of our pants, all of us. And we're all in this together. And it's okay that we don't know all the bits and pieces and what everybody's doing. The important thing is remaining connected with one another, getting the essential basics done for sure. Everybody cares. Nobody goes to work saying, I want to do a crappy job today. And honestly, I haven't seen one person say, I'm really enjoying wearing my PJs and not doing anything necessarily. People don't want to be doing this. People are engaged, the majority of them. And it's about saying, okay, how do we keep them engaged? How do we look after them so that A, we don't lose them as employees. B, they don't have to worry too much about their finances and their families. And C, how do we manage the business at a basic level right now? It really isn't about what we typically do. It's really about, okay, back to basics.
Right. I love your focus on it right now. It's, yes, the survival of the business. That's important and it's paramount. But it's not about managing productivity as opposed to supporting people that are committed and yet hurting and anxious. And in those moments, expecting folks to perform at pre-COVID-19 sort of levels. Let's be honest, leaders, although we're probably working harder right now, how many be willing to admit that you're not operating at 100% right now either? Right? I'm the first one to put my hand up. There are moments where I feel highly productive, and there are moments where I'm just staring at my computer screen going, what the hell just hit us? Right? And it's I think most of us are having to deal with a level of shell shock over this whole situation that is impacting us. And if it's impacting us, it's impacting our people. So Sophie, that was amazing. Kathy, your thoughts on best practices around what you're seeing, what you're hearing from folks as you're talking to them. Again, I love how, Sophie, you're approaching this from a more of an organizational level, managing a company and a firm. And Kathy, your world is much more one-to-one as folks are coming to you under more normal circumstances, just the issues that they're facing with. And now, obviously, I'm sure coming to you with the added pressure that COVID-19 is causing. So what is your advice to leaders about how we can best support them?
Well, I just want to springboard off of Sophie's input, because all the research on productivity, if you look at productivity, when there's emotional intelligence in a workplace, your productivity is going to significantly increase. So what does that mean as a leader? Well, it means, again, back to compassion, listening, boundaries for yourself and others. And so much more, right? However, I agree, you have to back off that it's a whole paradigm shift now, and people are probably working harder because everybody's coming together in solidarity, and I think that flow is really helping people start to maybe even be more productive as well. So emotional intelligence increases productivity by far. Right.
Any of my colleagues that are on the call, Rob, Trev, Catherine, Steve, thoughts about what you're seeing with your clients and best practices that are being used on teams right now to support staff through these difficult times? Go for it, Rob. Unmute, brother. We can't hear you.
Wow, that's like a rookie mistake.
That's like a Steve Osmond move.
Yeah, that's a Steve Osmond move. I'm monitoring the Facebook group at the same time, so that's where I'm jumping back and forth. I probably unmuted Facebook. One of the things that a lot of it's certainly increasing the engagement, the conversations, the communication with team members. Many of because everything, of course, is now being done by video. I'm seeing a lot of clients who are having, if not weekly or daily, at least weekly, or as many check-ins as they can with their team, just to make sure that people are on board. Giving team members permission to take breaks, it really communicating what the expectations are during a season like this with the crisis. I recently was on a video call with a client on Friday morning, and they had actually recommended they are a leader they do leadership training specifically around how to lead teams remotely. And so they had recommended a book called Remote, which I thought, boy, that sounds familiar, by Jason Friel. And so I looked it up. I already had the book, and so devoured it. It's about an hour to read this book. It's a short book. And it talks about in there that in normal circumstances, this book was written in 2013, in normal circumstances, you'll actually see an increase in productivity by remote workers, because they often work more, not less, because they're working in the evenings or on the weekends because their workstation is right there. And so one of the recommendations that they certainly have is that as owners, you need to encourage your workers to set business hours and to stay away from their computers when or their work when they're not doing that. And I think even in a season like this, where yes, we're not working at the same productivity and there's lots of other distractions, remind your workers, your employees, again, to take those breaks, to caution and guard that they don't end up diving into too much stuff when they need to really be doing some of the self-care things that we heard of earlier. So that's one of the things that certainly has been a conversation I've had with a number of the clients that I coach that has certainly been helpful.
Yeah, that's so good, Rob, because I think it's true. For those, now we know that there are folks on this call and many folks that are out there who right now have already had to close the doors to their business, at least temporarily, and lay off staff. Right, so their situation, there is no option to work remotely, where others have an opportunity to continue their work but do it remotely. And so the issues are very different for groups that or for companies where staff have been laid off and the doors are closed. How does a leader support their team in that scenario, or support staff in that scenario? To your point, Rob, for a team that's working remotely, setting those proper boundaries so that your work doesn't become all consuming, because the importance of taking care of oneself is so paramount right now. That is so good. Steve, you reached out with a private message to me that you had something to throw in the mix here.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One is a little bit of a piggyback on what Rob just shared in terms of communication. And I would recommend that we over communicate. When we think we've communicated enough, communicate a little bit more. I had one owner say that his staff were doing the opposite of what he asked. And I said, well, did you communicate with him? He said, yeah, I sent an email. And I said, well, they've probably got 50 emails from 50 different companies and banks and insurance, and everybody's sending emails. So find the effective way to communicate. One of the things that we always want to in communication is close that loop to make sure that we've been heard. So sending an email